Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about food challenges in the United States. Our discussion will include food distribution and delivery systems and the issues facing those industries, and we'll also talk about rising costs confronting food producers and consumers alike. My guest today is Peter Friedmann. Mr. Friedmann is the Executive Director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thank you. Very glad to be here. Very important topic.
Well, let's get started on the first question, and that has to do with the after effects of the pandemic. Most of us became aware of food shortages here in the United States during the pandemic. Now, this was obviously an unusual circumstance, having a pandemic, but it did lead to some food shortages. Some people would even say a crisis when the shelves were empty. So the industry, the food production and distribution industry, had to take a quick turn during the pandemic to meet the needs. So the first question is, have we fully recovered from the pandemic of 2020? And have we learned any long-term lessons from it?
The short answer is we have not fully recovered. And the reason is that the food shortages were not because there were less food being produced and less harvested, less grown, fewer cattle, etc. The problem was the distribution system. When we don't distribute timely and efficiently, then we have shortages. So the shortages on the shelves that you referenced were because we couldn't get the products from the origins where they are produced around the country and around the world. When we import food, couldn't get them distributed to warehouses and then to distribution facilities and then ultimately onto the grocery store shelves. It was a transportation challenge rather than a food production challenge.
All right, have we learned any long-term lessons from that?
Yes, we've learned that when there is increased demand, we do not have the capacity to handle increased demand for the products that we import into the United States and then distribute around the country. We are essentially working at maximum capacity all the time. And when we have a situation such as we have every year around Christmas time or back to school time, when we have more product moving, whether it's food or otherwise, moving through the distribution system, we don't have the capacity in this country to handle the peak periods. And we had just now 2.5 years of peak distribution demand, whereas usually every year we have for about a month around back to school and about a month around Christmas. That's when we have peak demand, and that's when we have shortages in our distribution system. Lack of truck, rail, ocean, and port capacity. We've been operating at capacity more or less for the last few years, and now we had 2.5 years of learning that when this demand is sustained, we cannot handle it. We need to expand our capability, our capacity for distribution, transportation distribution in this country.
I want to move to another topic that's related to this, and that is the labor shortage that we experienced during the pandemic. We know that the term essential worker became very well known during the pandemic, and that did affect the food producers, the food packing plants, meat packing plants, and so forth. And because of lockdowns, we didn't have as many people working via the fact that COVID also was rippling through some of these food processing plants. So you would see food processing plants closing down for a short period of time because they didn't have sufficient numbers of workers. And now that we've gone through that worst phase of the pandemic, again, that was 3 years ago now, we still seem to have a shortage of labor in those food packing plants. Do we have a handle on that?
No, we don't. And in fact, it wasn't just the food packing plants. It was at the Walmart and Amazon distribution centers all around the country in the major metropolitan areas where COVID took too many workers out of availability, were not able to show up to work. And that was where much of our distribution systems began to fail. We did not have enough people working in the warehouses all around the country. Now, food packing plants and in the heartland, we have had a labor shortage for quite a few years. Preceding the pandemic, preceding COVID, we have had a shortage of labor in the farming and food producing areas in the country, rural areas, which is ironic considering we have so many people that are trying to come into the country, that are coming into the country across the southern border, who would be glad to work in some of these places if our current immigration system would allow them to be hired throughout the food producing areas of the country, which they're not. So we have an ongoing labor shortage throughout much of our economy. And when we were operating at peak capacity, we were able to hold it together for quite a few years in these various big distribution centers, the Kroger, the supermarket distribution centers, warehouses, and so forth. But again, when demand grew, or when supply of labor was reduced due to the pandemic, due to the coronavirus stay-at-home mandates, we were short of labor and things slowed down.
Well, to make matters worse, at a number of food processing plants, warehousing facilities, and so on, we had this seemingly excessive number of fires or even explosions at some of these plants. And it just seemed like once a week or every other week, we were hearing about another food plant being shut down because of a fire or some sort of explosive incident. So the question, some of the folks that have looked at this have speculated that one of the reasons for that was because during the pandemic, we were trying to keep those processing facilities going 24/7 to produce the food to meet the demand that we've been talking about. And because of that, the theory is, well, those plants weren't being closed down for regular routine maintenance, for generators and things of that nature, and maybe that is a contributing factor. Is that part of the problem, or what is your take on why we've had so many incidents, including fires and explosions at food processing plants?
Well, you know, whether we're talking a food processing plant in Arkansas or in Dakota Dunes, South Dakota, or whether we're talking about a distribution center for groceries in Riverside, California, right in the heart of Los Angeles or right in the heart of New York City, where they have distribution centers right there, we had a shortage of labor everywhere. The other thing to remember, they all work 24/7 anyway. Currently, before the pandemic, after the pandemic, they are built to be working 24/7 with some breaks for maintenance, et cetera, scheduled maintenance. So that happens in the rural areas and in the metropolitan areas, just like the grocery stores. They're working 24/7, even when they're closed. They are open internally. They are stocking the shelves. They're taking deliveries at night. They're doing the repairs. All of that happens 24/7. And I think many people learned that's how our economy works. It is actually working 24/7. So even when the docks at the ports were shut down, people thought shut down because the gates are closed. Inside, they are working and moving the containers around, unloading the ships and so forth. That happens 24/7. So again, when we have peak demand, we don't have enough, or a shortage of labor because people are staying home, people are sick, people are mandated to stay home, then we have trouble. And some of the maintenance issues are a result of that trouble. We have the railroad problem in Ohio, where we had a rail car, a series of rail cars carrying chemicals came off the rail. That was because there was a little less maintenance being done on some of the trigger signals along the way, partially because we have had a rail labor challenged now, and we're post-pandemic, but we have a shortage of labor from time to time in much of our distribution systems, and much of our food in this country moves around by rail and of course by truck. And we have shortages of labor when there are labor contract negotiations going on, and it creates a disruption. And so we have disruption then, and we have disruption now on the West Coast when it comes to port labor, ongoing negotiations, and that impacts the ability to distribute in the normal, timely manner.
I'm glad you mentioned the railroads, because that was going to be the next question anyway. We had a potential strike last fall of 2022, that was averted when most of the unions ratified a contract agreement, but there were a few, 2 or 3 unions that were not going to ratify, and that was threatening to shut down the rail system until the contract could be negotiated to the point where those remaining unions would sign on. However, the Biden administration did come in and impose the contract that had been negotiated, that had been ratified by most unions, so it put the railroads back into full operation. They didn't actually close, but the sustaining of the railroad operations was maintained because of that. Did we dodge a bullet by not having the rail unions go on strike ultimately? And how important, you mentioned that most of our, or a lot of our food, if not most of it, travels by rail. So what are your thoughts about the rail strike before, or the potential strike, since we didn't have the strike, but what about before and after the ratification of the new contract?
So I guess the question is, how dependent are we and the world on our rail for distribution of food? The rest of the world is truly dependent on the U.S. rail system, because that's how our wheat and soybeans that go throughout the world, including the demand for product that was coming from Ukraine, that moves in bulk on railroad cars throughout the country. But there's something else that also moves by rail that many people don't appreciate: electricity. Everybody's buying electric cars. Not everybody, many are electric cars. Where does that electricity come from? It comes from coal. And how does that coal get moved around the country to coal burning electric generating plants? By rail. So that would have been another major impact if this potential strike that you mentioned would have occurred. We would have had a shortage of electricity, because we would not have had the coal moving to the places it needs to go to generate electricity that's used in urban areas, metropolitan areas throughout the country. So there's much that's dependent on rail. It's much out of sight, it's out of mind, but throughout our economy, we need the rail, and it needs the rail all the time, not from time to time. It has to constantly move.
Well, we're learning from this conversation that we're a 24/7 operation for food distribution, food production, rail, everything. And so we're going to go to the break right now, Peter, but when we come back from the break, we'll continue this conversation, and we'll start by talking about the mighty Mississippi River. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Peter Friedmann, the Executive Director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. Peter, when we went to the break, I teased the fact that we're going to talk about the Mississippi River, referred to as the mighty Mississippi. Now, a lot of people here where I live, when they hear about the Mississippi River, they think of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But in reality, the Mississippi River is still a very important food distribution artery in the United States, taking products from north to south. So, because of a drought situation last fall, it looked like they were going to have to shut down major portions of the river, which would have precluded barge traffic. And I think they did have a lot of problems with that in the fall. Army Corps of Engineers stepped in and did some digging and trenching wherever they could to facilitate as much traffic as possible. But really, it wasn't until we got the rains and the snow and so forth in the fall, late fall and winter, that it seemed like things were starting to turn around with the river. And we've had good snowfall in Wisconsin and Minnesota this past winter, so that's the headwaters of the Mississippi, so that should help things move along for the near term. So the question is, how important is the Mississippi River for barge traffic? What does the barge traffic do for agricultural distribution? And the follow-up question to that will be, should we be as reliant on the Mississippi as we are today?
Few people who have not yet gone to the Mississippi River and seen it, or the Ohio River, the tributaries, can appreciate how powerful a transportation artery it is. Each one of those barges, or what they call the tows, carries the equivalent of 2,000 trucks of cargo, each one. They are so massive, and that river is so massive, and the locks and dams are so massive. People have no idea. All the cargo transiting the freeways in around Los Angeles or something goes on a couple barges, and there are dozens and dozens of those barges moving all the time, constantly, or tows, as they're called there, TOWS, up and down the river. It's massive. The biggest source in the world for grain and soybeans is the Mississippi River system, because it's close to the areas of production and because it can carry such large volumes. So it is essential. The other thing about it is it goes north and south. Now, to the extent we want to bring things to the West Coast from the middle of the country, it's not that much of a help. But to the extent that we want to get things from the middle of the country down to the ports on the Gulf of Mexico, it's essential. And that's why those ports are the major distribution for much agriculture going to the rest of the world from the US. Now, the river, we can call it the mighty Mississippi. It's mighty if it has water. If it doesn't have water, it's not much use. And so, during the period that there was a drought and there wasn't enough water in the river, and the river couldn't sustain that barge traffic, I was interviewed, and they asked, what's the secret? How are we going to get the Mississippi River back operating and carrying those barges and so on? And they were looking for some magic thing. And I said, well, the answer is rain. And they were sort of disappointed that it wasn't a sexier response. But the fact is, you need rain to keep a river system operating. And that's not only in the Midwest, it's in the West Coast as well. And so sure enough, as you mentioned, when the snow came, when the rains came, it filled up. This is not the first time it's happened. It's not the last time it's happened that there hasn't been enough rain and there hasn't been enough water in the river. It'll happen again. And when it does happen, the unfortunate thing is there's no substitute. First of all, the railroads and all the trucks in the world don't carry as much cargo, don't have as much capacity as what the river can handle when it's operating, when the barges are operating. The second thing is our major freeways don't go north-south, they go east-west. So what happens is that huge storage facilities are constructed, and these storage facilities are so large that they will be the equivalent of 5 football fields, just one storage football, 5 football fields with walls about 20 foot high around, and then the cargo is just dumped in there. The soybeans are dumped in that, and they go up to 100 feet high, peaked at about 100 feet high. So you imagine 100-foot high, 5-foot football fields, and that's just to store what would go on one barge, because you can't do anything with it. There isn't enough truck and rail capacity to move it. So we're dependent, the world is dependent on that river, and we're dependent on the rail or the rain to fill the river.
Well, Peter, let's move on now to talk about the war in Ukraine. You touched on this in an earlier answer, but I want to go into it in a little more detail. When the war started in February of 2022, the grain prices, commodity prices shot way up because there was uncertainty about how much grain would come out of that Black Sea area, because Ukraine and Russia are huge producers of wheat and corn and other crops. And so now that we have this Black Sea agreement and we do see grain coming out of that region, and the agreement is always up to renewal, if that renewal occurs and if we continue to see that product, that agricultural product, exported out of the Black Sea area, are the grain prices, commodity prices, going to stay high in spite of that? And if so, why are the commodity prices so high compared to just a couple of years ago?
The commodities are either being produced, they're being transported, they're being stored, or they're being distributed to the end user. And when you have a shortage in the production, and then you get that production going again, it takes a while for the system to fill, to get the traffic, the bulk vessels back, get them filled, and get them moving to the storage facilities of big grain elevators around the world that have to be filled so that you can continuously draw down to the ultimate consumer. So it's a big system, and when it was drawn down, which it was when Russia invaded the Ukraine and the shortages began, Ukraine has not restored all its production yet, nor has Russia, by the way, restored its production. The transport vessels are not all there and filled because there isn't as much production back available. And again, those grain elevators to which the vessels were bringing the grain are not filled. So commodity prices are still high because there's still a shortage. Just because you can now start bringing product and you've removed one roadblock, if you will, to the distribution doesn't mean that that product is being produced in the same volumes as it has been traditionally, or is being transported in the same volumes or stored in the same volumes until that whole system fills. And it could be years. Commodity prices will be high. There's another reason commodity prices are high is because commodities, there's nothing special about Ukraine or Russian grain versus US grain or Brazilian grain or Australian or Argentinian grain. It's all the same. But if you can't get the fertilizer you need at a reasonable price to grow it wherever you are in the world, then you're going to have less production and more expensive production of the grain. And so that's another reason commodity prices are high, not just because of the disruption of the Ukrainian production, which is still disrupted for the reasons I gave, but because fertilizer costs are through the roof around the world, and that increases the cost of production and thus the cost of the commodity.
And I was going to ask you that. What about the fertilizer costs? They've gone up. They even started to go up before the war in Ukraine. And so what's behind this rising cost of fertilizers?
For a couple of reasons. One is that some of the inputs to make fertilizer are becoming in short supply in some places. Two, we don't have all those inputs here. You need some of the product. It comes from Canada and other places. And finally, major environmental opposition and permitting restrictions on fertilizer production in this country. We have some companies have already spent $30 million, one company, $30 million on trying to get a fertilizer production facility permitted and in operation here before they've even built it. And the US government is, they're now, I think, 7 to 10 years in the permitting process. We have an absolutely broken permitting system in this country for industrial development, particularly when it comes to handling of environmentally sensitive products, such as those that go into fertilizer production. So it's a self-imposed. There are a number of reasons why our food costs are high in this country, and they are self-imposed by ourselves, our government, on the producers. And fertilizer is one where we can point to an absolutely broken permitting process in this country, which has limited fertilizer production and driven the production that does happen through the roof.
We only have a couple minutes left for the program, Peter, so there's at least a couple things I want to go through before we have to wrap up. One is trucking regulations. I know that there are some trucking regulations in California that affect the cost and the distribution process for food. If you could briefly talk about those trucking regulations and the impact they've had on food distribution from California.
California has the lowest allowable legal truck weights in the world, in the United States and in the world. Texas joins California, unusual, but they do when it comes to restricting truck weights. What's the difference with truck weights? And why do all the other states, Oregon, Washington, and then Canada and Europe, everybody else allows higher truck weights? Because higher truck weights, ironically, mean less wear and tear on the road because you have more axles to spread the load, and are safer because they brake faster, shorter, because the extra axles again. The congestion in California and the air pollution that is caused by those low truck weights is because in other states, in Oregon and Washington and all the rest of the world, the product that you can bring in one truck, in California, you need 2 trucks to carry the same volume, same amount of product. So that means in the freeways of California, trying to get into the ports of LA and Long Beach and into Oakland and so forth, they're congested. You're driving around on those freeways. You have twice as many trucks in many of those corridors than you need because you have these low truck weight limits of 80,000 pounds gross vehicle weight, while in Washington and Oregon and most of the world, 105,500, mean you need 2 trucks in California to carry what 1 truck can carry in most of the world and in many US states. That's a cause of congestion, delay, and higher cost.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've run out of time, Peter, but I want to thank you for being with us today and answering a lot of questions that many people have about rising food costs and where we stand in terms of distribution. So thanks again, Peter, and our viewers, thank you as well. Stay tuned for more programming from Cal State Long Beach on Beach TV. Be sure to join us again for another episode of Talking Points. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.